All right, welcome back, everyone. We're going to continue where we left off as far as reproductive material. So let's just go down to where we were. If I remember correctly, the last thing we were discussing was the female reproductive system. And the last thing we mentioned, where we were just circling and underlining the major structures of the female reproductive system that we will need to learn. Not as many as in the men. It's a little bit both systems overall, not too terribly complicated. Obviously, this perspective here is more of a side angle. There is another image coming up that we may see in today's video that shows more of a top-down perspective, and that's more of the traditional view. As I mentioned in the last video, it resembles often these like deer antler look, especially with the fallopian tubes. But we'll see that as we progress. So again, just make sure in the videos you're paying attention that not everything on these images, like for male or female, we need to know. Just the stuff that I'm focusing on, and that's the stuff that you'll see for the test for this last unit. All right, so the main organ in both male and female reproductive systems, we refer to them as gonads, right? We already mentioned that the male gonad is going to be the testes or the testicles. Well, in women, the main gonad is going to be the ovaries. Both sexes are going to have two sets, so they're going to have both ovaries, two ovaries or two testes. Now, as far as the ovaries are concerned, they are composed of these ovarian follicles, these sac-like structures found inside. The structure of the ovarian follicle, it's going to secrete what's called these oocytes. These oocytes are premature eggs, basically, that are still needing to be fertilized, right? That's kind of the entire purpose. But the idea of all this, as far as this corpus luteum breaking down and eventually secreting that oocyte, this is all part of the ovulation cycle, something that all women have to go through once a month until they reach the menstruation. So it is something that is semi-regular. Obviously, there are instances where cycles are missed, and it's not necessarily an indication of a fertilized egg or pregnancy. But for most cases, this is a pretty regular cycle that most women become very comfortable with after puberty occurs. All right, moving on to a little bit more relating to those follicular stages. The primary follicle contains an immature oocyte. So again, if we go back up here, it's what we see deep in the ovary. It's an immature cell. Then we have what's called the Graphian or the vesicular. I'm not going to get too crazy with that. Growing follicle will become a maturing oocyte. Ovulation is when the egg is mature enough and the follicle will rupture. The big thing here, and I'm going to go ahead and underline that, this occurs about every 28 days. So again, something that most women post-puberty already are aware of, but every 28 days there is an ovulation process, an ovulation cycle, which that means that in the instance of someone trying or working to get pregnant, there is a window of time that is more appropriate for that to occur. Does that mean that a woman cannot get pregnant if she is not ovulating? Not necessarily. As we're going to learn as we progress a little bit further, sperm can actually live quite a bit of time. Most of them do not. Most of them die within minutes to maybe hours outside of the male body. But occasionally, some of them can last longer, and sometimes it kind of syncs perfectly with when an egg was released from the ovaries. So there are these odd situations, but in most cases, especially for a couple trying to purposefully fertilize an egg, it's usually better to try to work around when the ovulation process is actually happening. Okay. So as far as support for the ovaries, this is actually, I'm going to scroll back up to show us what we saw, but these are these, and we can see it on the bottom slide coming up too. We have these special ligaments. We talked about ligaments before. We've talked about tendons before. We are familiar that it's a cartilaginous type tissue that just holds things in place, sometimes bone to muscle or bone to bone, right? In this case, we have special ligaments that help to secure these female reproductive organs. So for instance, the suspensory ligaments help to secure the ovaries to the walls of the pelvis. The ovarian ligaments help to attach the ovaries to the uterus. And then the broad ligament is going to be this massive fold over what's called the peritoneum and encloses the suspensory ligament. So it just keeps this first one in place. So just to show us what I was talking about, if I scroll back up to here, we had a couple of these ligaments already that we're able to kind of see. So for instance, we have the suspensory ligament, we have the round ligament right here, and then we can see the broad ligament right here as well. And this is just from that perspective. The next perspective, which is what we're going to show us right now, this is the more classical version of the female reproductive system that you'll regularly see from a forward perspective instead of, or an anterior posterior perspective instead of a side perspective or transverse perspective. But just to show us what we just saw previously, right? We're able to see these regions once again. We see the broad ligament once more. We see the suspensory ligament. And then we're also able to see a little bit of the round ligament popping up back here. Now, the reason why I like these different angles of view, of perspective, is because, for instance, when you're looking at the broad ligament here and the suspensory ligament, it's kind of hard to tell which is which. It doesn't show it as clear as we would like. The round ligament's straightforward enough, right? It just looks like a little tiny tube that's coming out. But in the other image that I just showed you guys, it shows the suspensory and the broad a little clearer. So that's really why I like to do that type of stuff and show it a little bit more vividly. But yes, this is the traditional view. Again, the common nickname for this is what we refer to as like the deer antlers, just from the fallopian tubes, if you're looking at it from that perspective. Okay, we're going to move down a little bit. All right, so the major organ that we mentioned already was the ovaries, right? The female gonads. From there, we have what's called the uterine tubes, also known as the fallopian tubes. I tend to just refer to it as the fallopian tubes. Yeah, it is also known as the uterine tubes, and it makes sense, right? It's connecting to the uterus, but fallopian is perfectly fine as well. The job of the fallopian tubes is to receive the oocyte. So it's going to catch the egg that's secreted by the ovaries. Interestingly enough, let's just scroll back up just a smidge here. You'll see the ovaries, right? Go ahead and circle that just to make sure we're all on the same page. The ovaries are actually suspended. They're not directly connected to the fallopian tube. It looks like it, right? It looks like they're kind of being grabbed in place, but they're very, very, very microscopic small distance between the two, which is why we actually have what we refer to as the fimbriae right here to catch those eggs. And the fimbriae is part of the fallopian tube. That's what we're going to see as we progress. So once again, it's going to catch or receive those ovulated oocytes. It is the site for fertilization. Let's go back up just to make sure. So traditionally speaking, it does vary sometimes as far as where the sperm actually fuses with the egg, but more often than not, we're looking at somewhere around here. So the sperm have to pass through the vaginal canal, through the cervix, through the uterus, enter the fallopian tubes, and still reach the egg for fertilization to occur. So it is a long trek. It is a very tedious process. And again, as I mentioned in previous videos, is the entire reason why the male ejaculate has millions of sperm. If that number was significantly lower, in fact, when some couples are trying to get pregnant, so many times for the male perspective, that is a test that you do as far as get an idea of your counts per million, as far as how many sperm are you ejaculating. If your number is too low, even if it's in the hundreds of thousands, which still sounds like an astronomically high number, that can severely reduce the chances of a normal pregnancy occurring without the need of like in vitro fertilization or other uses or other tools. So it is something that is a difficult process to occur, which again, it all plays up to evolutionary buildup. How the only reason our species still exists the way it does is because of things that have gone into play. So as we can see, again, why we call it the uterine tubes, it attaches directly to the uterus, does not physically attach to the ovary like I just showed you guys earlier, and is supported by the broad ligament. So the broad ligament helps to hold those arm structures, kind of held out like in that direction, hold those arm structures in place. Okay, a little bit more about the fallopian tubes. The fimbriae, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, are these finger-like projections that are at the end of the fallopian tubes, and they're going to catch the eggs or receive the oocyte. We also have what's called the cilia. Cilia, we've seen something like that before. Cilia are just these little tiny hair-like structures, and they help to move the egg. So they're inside the fallopian tube. They slowly move the oocyte towards the uterus. Notice here, we'll go ahead and underline that as well, takes 3 to 4 days. Now, that's very important in relationship to the longevity of sperm, right? Remember how I was just mentioning that sperm can live prolonged periods of time sometimes? We refer to them as sometimes like super sperm, or there's been cases of sperm living up to a week after an ejaculate in the female body. That said, this is why it is very careful regarding ovulation periods and just how long the egg is lasting. If we go back up a little bit and we see that we mentioned that an egg is going to release every 28 days, right? While the egg releases, caught by the fimbriae, it starts to move along the fallopian tube via these tiny microscopic cilia. It's dragging the egg. But just that movement of dragging the egg takes 3 to 4 days. So at any point during those 3 to 4 days, if there was sexual intercourse, there is a possibility, and especially without any sort of protection, obviously, there is the possibility that that egg could still get fertilized. So the window of ovulation, like I mentioned, is not always so black and white. There are a little bit of leeway in both directions. So you do have to be a little bit careful with that. But yeah, that is important to understand as far as how many days it can take for the egg to make its way through. And as I mentioned earlier, fertilization, it is going to occur inside the uterine tube. The reason why, right, let's go back up to this picture. The reason why fertilization doesn't occur in the uterus, for instance, is because by the time the egg reaches the uterus, the female body has to make a decision. If the egg reaches the uterus and the egg has been fertilized, it will attach to the uterus wall and it will nourish. It will grow exponentially, right? That's a successful fertilization. If an egg reaches the uterus and it has not been fertilized, well, that's what we refer to as the menstrual cycle. As we're going to learn a little bit further, the walls, the physical walls of the uterus, specifically the endometrium, sheds off. And that shedding process called sloughing, it's actually going to remove that unfertilized egg. And a big reason why that has to happen is because if you were to just leave this egg tissue or this cell unfertilized, leave it alone on the walls of the uterus, and it's like, oh, well, who cares? These cells are very prone to becoming cancerous if not removed from the body. So that is something that women have to be very careful with as far as are they having a regular cycle. If these cells are not removed properly, like we mentioned, that could be catastrophic for them. Okay, and then finally, let's move on to the uterus. We'll talk a little bit about the uterus, and then I think that'll be a good place for us to stop for today. So the uterus, located between the bladder and the rectum, like we mentioned, you saw it in that first picture I showed you as far as the transverse or the side angle. It's smack dab in between the two. Again, it's a big reason why when a woman is pregnant, and especially into those second and third trimesters, and the uterus starts expanding significantly, you're going to experience issues with urinary problems or digestive problems. That's expected because those other organs are being squished. The uterus does have another name, just in case you see it this way, might as well, right? It is also known as the womb. So just be aware that's kind of the common name. It is a hollow organ. Again, obviously, right? That's where the baby would be developing. Functions of the uterus. It is going to receive the fertilized egg, retain the fertilized egg, so literally it fuses to the wall of the uterus, and then nourish the fertilized egg. Not until quite some time into development of the fertilized egg does the baby itself be able to start to nourish itself through the mother. So that takes quite a bit of time, and we're talking about things like the placenta forming. It takes a little while before we get there. So in these early stages, technically not even aware of Most women are not even aware that they'd be pregnant by this point. Literally, the cells are just being nourished directly from the uterus. So the uterus plays a major role in making sure that this stays alive. And then as far as support for the uterus is concerned, we see the broad ligament. We talked about that previously, right? We also have what's called the round ligament. It just helps to anchor and keep the uterus in place. And we also have what's called the uterosacral ligaments. These words sound complicated, but many times in anatomy, as we may have learned in the course already, you just have to break the word down into its components. Utero means uterus. Sacral means sacrum, right? The bones right above the coccyx. So as far as the spine is concerned. So these are just these ligaments originating from the sacral region, connecting to the uterus that helps to anchor and once again keep the uterus in place. So once more, we're showing this again to us so that we understand exactly where these structures are. I'm leaning more towards knowing this picture than the other transverse or side angle. Both helpful. Both are really good to know. But as far as what you might see on the test, this classic deer antler look is what you'd probably expect more likely to be the case. Finally, some stuff that I can finish up with as far as regarding to the uterus. There are different regions of the uterus. We've actually talked about one of the regions already. We have what's called the body, the fundus, and the cervix. So if I scroll back up, we should be able to see what these regions are pretty clearly. So first and foremost, the body is literally just going to be this main circular region, right? It's just the main hollow middle region. Easy, no big deal. That's obviously where the baby will start to develop into this end of first, second, third trimester, etc. The cervix is going to be the entrance of the womb or the uterus. So that is the end of the vaginal canal and the entrance of the uterus. The cervix is the area that gets dilated, so it expands significantly when a woman is pregnant and ready to, more specifically in labor, and ready for the baby to come out. Finally, we have what's called the fundus. The fundus, we've actually seen something like that before, if you remember back in digestive system earlier in this quarter. Fundus is another word for like the head. So the fundus in this case is going to be the top part of the uterus. The fundus, especially into the second and third trimester, and when a woman becomes much more visibly pregnant, that part of the uterus starts to really press upward. So literally, you're going to have the lungs kind of squeeze up, the heart kind of squeeze up a little bit, which it's common to have a little bit more tightness while in those stages of pregnancy. And then the stomach more specifically really gets pushed up. So unfortunately, a common side effect of pregnancy is more acid reflux or heartburn. Just because more stomach acid starts to come back up through the esophagus. So that is unfortunate that does happen a little bit more often. But again, it's kind of the process of childbearing and how the baby is able to grow. So that's always a big part of it as well. And we might as well finish up just so we're on topic with the uterus so that we can start a new topic on our next video. Let's talk about the layers of the uterus. Here's the thing. In many units, we've discussed these layers of tissue, right? We've talked about how there's layers of muscle, there's layers of heart, there's layers of bone, there's layers of a bunch of layers, right? Always, always, always just pay attention to the prefix. That is all you need to know. That's it. End story. Endo always tells us inner. Simple. Myo kind of tells us two things. Myo is middle, so I like the alliteration right there, myo middle. But myo is also a prefix indicating muscle. So it is the muscular layer of the uterus. And then finally, peri is just going to be the outer layer. Peri is often seen in many structures just to indicate as the outer layer, or perimetrium as we call it. The endometrium is going to be the site where the egg will attach itself, be it a fertilized egg or not, right? Because if it's an fertilized egg, it implants itself, it grows, it nourishes, etc., etc. If it's a non-fertilized egg, which is what's going to be the case for the vast majority of a female's life, it's just going to slough off. It's literally going to remove itself through a process known as menses. And again, that whole cycle is known as the menstrual cycle. The myometrium, as we just mentioned, it's all the smooth muscle. That smooth muscle is traditionally not very active until labor, until a woman is already in second, third trimester points of time where the baby's grown significantly. So normally these muscles are not very active, and generally speaking, smooth muscle, we don't really have control over anyway. We learned a lot about smooth muscle back in digestive system, a little bit in urinary system, and now we see it in reproductive system. And then again, the perimetrium, or the serous layer as we call it here, is just this outer region. So nothing too crazy there. We can actually see exactly where these regions are. So I would just make sure we know those 3 regions of the uterus, know a little bit of their responsibilities, and we're good to go. Okay, so that's a great place to stop. Thanks so much for tuning in. Like I said, we're about the halfway mark of our material, making good progress, and yeah, we'll be done pretty shortly. Thanks, guys.